Hey guys, in this episode I'm going to talk about how you can make sure you don't overpay for your home.
Welcome to EDM Real Estate Secrets, the podcast for buyers and sellers in the Edmonton real estate market. You are now part of a small group of people who are trying to learn the ins and outs of real estate without the fluff. This podcast will give you an inside look at the daily life of a realtor and what I do to figure things out and get deals done for my clients. My name is Trevor Tardif, and welcome to EDM Real Estate Secrets.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of EDM Real Estate Secrets. In this episode, what I want to do is talk to you guys about how you can make sure you don't overpay for your next property. Now, the first thing that I would say could prevent you from overpaying for your first property would be getting educated about the real estate market. And the way that you get educated about the real estate market is you need to learn some different metrics or work with someone that actually does know these metrics and works in the real estate market, such as myself, and get an idea on how the market is performing overall in the city, as well as how it's performing in the individual neighborhood or region that you're actually interested in buying. So some of the most important metrics to look at when evaluating the real estate market to help you determine whether it's a buyer's or a seller's market is to look at things like the list price to sales price ratio. So that's the percentage of list price that the average property sells for. The absorption rate, or how many months of inventory there are. And one of the other important ones would be the average days on market. There we go. So those three metrics are important to look at for the city as well as the individual region that you're actually interested in purchasing in. And the reason that you want to look at both is there's a trap that some people can fall into where they might have a pretty good idea on what's going on in their market in the city, and they might take that and assume that, okay, well, the market's down in the city, it's a buyer's market, and they just assume that they can go into any property and be aggressive that way, thinking that all sellers should be willing to lower their price. But that's not the case. There are some neighborhoods or regions that are performing better than the city, and sometimes you can even have a mini seller's market in certain neighborhoods. So that's why it's important to look at both. You need to compare the two. So by doing that, what it'll allow you to do is you'll be able to also compare how that neighborhood or region is doing compared to the city, if it's doing better or worse, and that'll give you some really good information that you can use when you're going into a negotiation. Now, the second thing that you can do to make sure that you don't overpay for a property is to not fall in love with a property. Obviously, that's easier said than done, but as soon as you do fall in love with a property, you make decisions differently. So you're a lot less likely to make a decision purely based on numbers, because now you're motivated by the desire of getting that property. You've already decided that you just have to have that property, and you're also motivated by fear of losing that property. So if you get into that kind of headspace where you have to have a property, it's pretty hard to walk away, and that'll show in your negotiation. Now, just because you fall in love with a property, that doesn't mean that you're definitely going to overpay for a property, but it does increase the likelihood that you could overpay for it. So some people have the opinion that that's actually the way that you should decide what property you buy, is if you do fall in love with it. That's part of their criteria, that you just have that feeling that this is the one. And I do think there is some merit to that, but I also believe that something that could make you fall in love with a property can be quite subjective, and lots of times it might be based on the style of the current homeowner. You might really like the way that they've painted or decorated, or the furniture that they have, and that can cause you to really get attached to that property. And you can do those sort of things afterwards to any property that you buy. You can always make those adjustments, so keep that in mind. Now, the third thing that you can do to help prevent yourself from overpaying for a property is to give yourself more purchasing options. And what I mean by that is to either expand your search so that you've got other properties that will also work for you. If there's not a whole lot that fits the exact criteria that you initially started with, or if you've actually got other properties that you can basically go buy, because then you know that if it doesn't work out with this property, I can always move on to one of these other ones, and that'll reflect itself in the way that you negotiate on that property. Number 4, so the fourth thing that you can do to prevent yourself from overpaying for a property is to don't assume that the list price is a fair market value for the property. So every seller and every real estate agent can price properties differently. So just because that's what something's listed for, that doesn't mean that that's actually what it's worth. And that happens for many different reasons. Some sellers like to price their properties higher intentionally to leave room for negotiating room, because they believe that everybody likes to negotiate, everybody tries to negotiate down, and they just sort of make that assumption that you need some negotiating room. So that's one reason that somebody might price their property higher than the market value. Or the seller might just think the property is worth more, or their agent might think it's worth more. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that somebody could price it higher than what the market value is. But that's not the point. The point is that you don't want to assume that that's what it's worth. And this actually goes into the 5th point, which is that you've got to evaluate the recent comparable sales, or do what's called a comparative market analysis. That's how you actually determine market value and what a property is worth, by looking at the most recent comparable sales. Now, the way that I would do that is I like to look for properties that are the same type of property. So that's if it's a single family home or a duplex, a townhouse, that kind of thing. I'm looking for ones that are similar size, so they're roughly the same size of property. And I'm also looking for ones that have similar finishes, so in terms of flooring, how the kitchen and bathroom have been renovated, all that kind of thing. So I'm looking for properties that are as close as possible to the subject property and using those ones as comparables. So you will need a realtor to do that part for you. So if you're working with me, obviously I can do that for you, because you do need back-end access to the MLS to look at recent sales. The very best comparables are actually properties that have sold within the last 3 months. So just keep that in mind. All right, so the number 6, so the 6th thing that you can do to prevent yourself from overpaying for a property is to be patient. And the reason I say that is that some sellers need time before they're willing to lower their price. You might have situations where you're negotiating on a property and you've gotten to a point where any more money for the property and you feel like it's too much, and the seller might also be at a point where they feel like selling the property for any less is too little. And this situation is actually the most common when a property has first been listed. So when it's very new to the market, it hasn't been for sale that long, and it's just because sellers often, when they're in that sort of scenario, they're more likely to want to hold out to see if they can get more money for the property, since the property hasn't been on the market as long and it hasn't been as exposed to as many buyers. So they might want to hold out and see if they can get more money for the property from a different buyer. So that's a motivator for them. And going back to what I was saying, so I say be patient, because if this happens and you get in that situation, it could just be because the seller hasn't had their property on the market that long. And what could happen is they might not be willing to sell it for a lower price at that point, but after it's been on the market for longer, maybe they will be willing to sell it for less. So that can go a number of different ways. It's possible that they could actually get another buyer that is willing to pay for it, pay more for it. And it is also possible that they won't find another buyer, and then they will be more motivated to sell for less later. So that's a decision that you would have to make if you are willing to wait on the property to see if they're willing to come down on price as more time goes on. And of course, if you do that, you are going to risk losing the property if another buyer comes along. So you just have to be willing to accept the consequences of whatever choice you do make in that situation. Now, going into number 7, so the 7th thing that you can do to prevent yourself from overpaying for a property is to be willing to walk away from the property if you can't make a deal at a fair price with the seller. So this almost feeds directly into the last one about being patient, but I wanted to put this as a separate point just because this is something that can be used as both a negotiating tactic as well as just a way of protecting yourself from overpaying for a property. So if you're not willing to walk away from a property, for example, and the seller's not willing to lower their price to what you think is reasonable, you're going to end up paying for it. The seller's got you. If you're in that situation, it doesn't matter how unreasonable that you think the seller might be being with their price. If you're not willing to walk away, you're going to end up paying more for that property. So by being willing to walk away and actually end the negotiation and walk away, that protects you from overpaying for the property. But sometimes just being willing to do that and stepping away from the property will actually cause the seller to come around in some scenarios, because now they're afraid of losing you as a buyer. And if they lose you as a buyer, that could mean a number of different things for them. They might be afraid that they won't get another buyer within a reasonable period of time, and that could actually cause them to come down on price just because you were willing to walk away. So hopefully that one makes sense. And the 8th and final thing that I would say is probably the best and easiest way to prevent yourself from overpaying for a property is to work with a competent realtor who knows how to do all these things and can help you with that. So by working with a realtor, we can definitely take care of most of those things for you. Obviously, I can't prevent you from falling in love with a property if you do, but a lot of this stuff can be overwhelming to process. So if you're working with a realtor that's competent and they understand this stuff, then they can do the comparative market analysis for you. They can do the market analysis to tell you about the stats and analyze the market for you. They can guide you along that whole process. So that's probably the quickest and easiest way to make sure that you don't overpay for a property, is just to work with a competent realtor. So hopefully you guys got a lot of value out of that. This has got to be the longest episode that I've done so far. I hope you guys liked it. Let me know what you think, and leave me a comment if you got any questions, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
Do you have a real estate question you'd like me to answer? If so, go to edmrealestatesecrets.ca, where you can send me a quick voice message with your question. From there, you can also get all past episodes on iTunes or watch all the video episodes on YouTube and Facebook. Check it out at edmrealestatesecrets.ca.